minute, just if there are some last minute participants trying to join us. We are looking forward to a very interesting discussion on a topic that has become very important and topical at the same time, especially in the IR space. In a few moments, I'll be introducing my panelists, and then we'll go straight into the conversation. So, like I said, I'll just give a minute to allow for any last minute participants to join. Thank you.
And I will never, I've never felt that way in my life. And my goodness, I'll never forget that feeling, ever. And then when I found out it was her, another collapse.
They didn't know it was each other.
Another collapse.
Oh.
Another collapse.
I don't think you knew on that phone call. I don't think we told you on that phone.
No.
Me?
Yeah, did we?
I didn't know.
You were like, don't tell anyone.
Oh.
I'm telling everyone right now. So mine was an emergency.
What? Oh my. Breaking news now from the Supreme Court, which...
Alrighty, so I'll go ahead and start. And we were supposed to be joined by Professor Alonso, Illueca, and Mr. Paul Nantulya, who was with us earlier. I don't know whether Paul is still with us, but we'll go ahead with this. So Professor Alonso is an associate professor and researcher at the Universidad Santa Maria La Antigua. So Prof is going to be taking us through the security and law enforcement cooperation between China and Panama. Prof, you have about 15 minutes to give us an overview of what the security and law enforcement cooperation between China and Panama look like. If Paul is able to join us, we would hear from Paul, and then we'll go into a Q&A where we allow participants to share their questions or insights with us. Otherwise, I would also share some insights from Africa, and then we can juxtapose the two and have a fruitful discussion. So, Prof, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arhin. I hope you guys can hear me well. I'm greeting you guys from Panama City, Panama. I was hoping to join you guys in Nairobi, Kenya. But I'm very happy to speak about the security and law enforcement cooperation that currently exists between my country, Panama, and the People's Republic of China. In order to frame the discussion, we need to understand that the security relationship between Panama and China is pretty recent, although remains significant in its scope. By recent, I mean that diplomatic relations between Panama and China were established in 2017. This basically created a wave in Central America because after the establishment of diplomatic ties between Panama and China, then El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Honduras decided to break ties with Taipei and establish diplomatic ties with Beijing. And the establishment of diplomatic ties was also significant in that regard because it also amplified the scope of the relationship between Central America as a whole and China. In the security perspective of this relationship, there are significant challenges that we're currently facing. Most likely, and the most important one, remains that China is not a party or is not an observer state of the Central American integration system, which has a democratic security treaty framework that establishes certain provisions to the member states of the SICA in order to establish any type of security cooperation with China. This is an important thing to have in mind in order to frame our discussion of the relationship between China and Panama security-wise. So, an important thing to note is that Panama has a close relationship with the U.S. It's important to know that since 1999, since December 31st, 1999, Panama has full control over its territory, full control over the canal, and is in charge of the security of the canal. Nonetheless, this has not translated into practice in the sense that the U.S. has nothing to do in the security relationship with Panama. Ties remain very close, and the U.S. remains a key donor security-wise and law enforcement-wise. So when Panama established diplomatic relationships with China, the first focus of the agenda was not the security sector. But through time, after 2018, it became an important factor. The most significant security project that China currently has in Panama is the Security and Emergency Operations Center, Colon C2. This is a cybersecurity PRC-funded installation, which is under the control of Panamanian authorities, but it was the result of a non-refundable operation project of more than $10 million. This project is molded after the Shenzhen Safe City system. Basically, it equips Colon City with state-of-the-art technology, including 291 video surveillance towers, high-resolution cameras in 92 locations, 11 panic buttons, and 5 highway arch with license plate readers, computerized units, dispatch systems, video analysis, and facial recognition system. This may sound familiar to you as China geeks, because this is the same model that is currently being used in Xinjiang, the same model that is being used to surveil the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, and the same model that is currently used in China as a whole to promote some type of homogeneous society. I excuse myself. So this is without doubt problematic, because we are dealing with the city of Colon, which is the most dangerous city in Panama, the city that has the most critical crime rates throughout the country. Shenzhen also is the host of all the surveillance systems that have been deployed throughout the PRC and are now currently being deployed in Panama, which will tend us to think that we are dealing with a draconian, Orwellian, and techno-dystopian system being deployed in Panama. Nonetheless, this has not translated into practice as being an aggressive and repressive system being deployed in the service of the Panamanian government. Although the full control over all these networks and over all these systems are not of the Panamanian government. They are jointly controlled between Panamanian and Chinese entities. This is why, for me, it's very curious why Panama chose to implement the Shenzhen Safe City model, because it also involves another very disruptive factor, which is Huawei. The Colon C2 uses 100% of equipment provided by Huawei, which again is directly linked to the Uyghur repression and the Uyghur crimes against humanity and the Uyghur genocide. This is not a rare occurrence in Panama, because if we look to the second most dangerous city, then we will find another security cooperation agreement. At this time, it's kind of a hybrid one, because we don't have a government-to-government cooperation. We have a private company to university cooperation. I'm talking about the project in San Miguelito. San Miguelito is a satellite city very close to Panama City. It has the second highest crime rate in the country after Colombia. And why is this important? Because in 2023, a Josu-based company called Houston Networks signed with the University of Panama an agreement to provide technology transfer and provide a cybersecurity laboratory in San Miguelito Regional Center of the University of Panama. This, again, tends to prove that the PRC, in its campaign for extending its influence in Panama, is taking special care in augmenting its influence in the security sector, and they are focused in two main areas. Number one, surveillance through artificial intelligence and top-of-the-line technology, and number two, cybersecurity. If we look at this in conjunction with the presence of different gangs, Chinese or PRC linked gangs, such as the one that Linan actually identifies in one of his papers, the Fuxing gang, the Flying Dragons, and the Taishen gang, then it acquires another different perspective. If we add to that the fact that cybersecurity concerns are the main threat that the Panama Canal is currently facing, for example, a cyber attack that will affect the operations of the Panama Canal, then it remains a significant challenge for Panamanian authorities to deal with. The second part of my presentation is focused on law enforcement cooperation. Again, this is an area where the U.S. also has significant influence, where the U.S. is Panama's closest partner. In both law enforcement and security, Panama's main partner remains the U.S. Nonetheless, we can also see that the Chinese are gaining ground, and they are gaining significant ground. When Panama established diplomatic ties with China, we signed more than 47 documents. And I'm a lawyer. I'm saying documents because they are not treaties. They are basically joint communiques. There are some treaties. There's an important number of treaties, maybe 20 treaties. But there are other non-binding documents that were signed by the Panamanian government. Among these documents, three are very important for law enforcement purposes. In 2018, Panama and China signed a bilateral extradition treaty. This treaty is currently pending approval by the Panamanian National Assembly, and it is most likely not going to be approved by the Panamanian Congress. Nonetheless, the non-approval of this treaty, together with the recurrent deportation operations undertaken by the Panamanian authorities of Chinese nationals to China, seem to point that Panama and China have reached a modus vivendi that allows Panama to deport irregular migrants, but also allows China to claim in deportations persons of interest. In another way, and this is the human rights lawyer speaking here, if we had a valid extradition treaty, for example, any lawyer, any human rights defender, any person that is concerned of the treatment that a prisoner is going to receive in China could oppose an extradition request based on different international instruments, such as the Provision Against Torture, such as the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, among others. But currently, right now, under the modus vivendi that the Panamanians and the Chinese have reached, we don't have a way to oppose any deportation. Under Panamanian law, the Chinese nationality continues to be a restricted nationality, which is dealt with directly by the National Security Council of Panama. Ergo, any deportation has to have the approval of the president, the Ministry of the Presidency, which is the equivalent of the Chief of Staff, and the Secretary of the National Security Council, which is in practice the person who takes the decision. So this is pretty complex, and this is an analysis that requires more in-depth thinking in the sense of which of the two poisons are worse, in the sense that either having an extradition treaty with China or having the current modus vivendi that allows China to use Panama as a deportation hub of persons of interest. The second agreement is something very interesting. Panama has a public security ministry very similar to the one that China has. Not as repressive, but the structure is kind of the same. They deal with organized transnational crime, the pursuit of fugitives, they coordinate the police forces in the country, etc. And they recently signed a letter of intent on cooperation between the two ministries. And they are particularly focused on combating organized crime on pursuing fugitives, the recovery of illegal assets, the exchange of personnel, capacity building, and a strengthening of police cooperation between sister cities. And this is another entire different universe. From a security perspective and a law enforcement perspective, the sister city agreements tend to have a significant effect on the law enforcement and cooperation security-wise between Panama and China, and with most of the countries of both Latin America and Africa. And why is that? Because sister city agreements, although they may seem to be very banal in their scope, this is just an agreement signed between the mayor of one city and the mayor of another city from China and Panama, or from Kenya and China, it wouldn't seem that they have in practice any type of effect. Nonetheless, when you read that in conjunction with the law enforcement cooperation agreements, you can find this exchange of personnel that allows, for example, police from Fuzhou or police from Shanghai or from Gobedian or Guangdong to conduct operations in Panama. This exchange of personnel, exchange of good practices, remains problematic because it could mean in practice the deployment of police personnel of a foreign country in the sovereign territory of Latin American and African countries. So whenever you conduct research, and I can say this from my experience as an analyst and researcher for the China Index, for the 2023 China Index, you will find that there are actual exchanges of personnel and police operations conducted by Chinese officials in Panama and in other countries of Latin America. Panama has sister city agreements with Guangdong and also with Shanghai. But Panama is not the only city that has this type of agreements. We also have Santiago de Veraguas with Fuzhou and Bodang, and Boquete with Gobedian. And these are the ones that are published. If we conduct further research, we could find that there is a wide scope of sister city agreements. Remember, and this is pretty important, Jiang Zemin, when he was mayor of Shanghai, he actually signed a sister city agreement with San Francisco, just to make another example. Lastly, there is an agreement on judicial cooperation between Panama's Attorney General and China's Ministry of Justice. This, again, is problematic because if you see the wording, you will think that there are zero problems with that, in the sense that we have legal assistance, tracing financial transactions, combating corruption, money laundering, organized crime, and narcotics. But whenever you take into account projects in which there is Chinese corrosive capital, for example, you have projects that have the participation of Shanghai Gorgeous, that's an enterprise linked to Anshin Trust that was subject of kind of a purge by the CCP or by the PRC. Then you will find that this type of cooperation between law enforcement of Panama and law enforcement of China will become problematic, in the sense that you will have Chinese officials using this type of agreement in order to conduct political purges. The same applies to exiles, and the same applies to political opponents. This is not only limited to the commercial side. So my general conclusion on this is that although Panama-China security and law enforcement cooperation is yet to be comprehensively developed, it has shown us another significant juncture. Panama, as most of Latin American and African countries, has many strategic deficiencies. We have to deal with endemic corruption, deficient performance on democratic governance, rule of law, human rights, among others. And China is seeking to exploit these strategic deficiencies. And in practice, this type of cooperation frameworks on security and law enforcement, with whenever it is done with countries that have this type of strategic deficiencies and are ill prepared to deal with a disruptive actor such as the one that China represents, tends to lead to an increase in the level of influence of the disruptive power in that country. That is, China increasing its influence in Panama. I hope it was useful, and I hope that I didn't abuse the time provided. Again, thank you, Arhin, and I'm happy to engage in a meaningful discussion and exchange ideas.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Alonso. I think that was very insightful. I have some initial questions for you, and then I would allow the audience to ask one or two questions. And if anything comes on the African side, I will step in, but I'll give some background if any of such questions come up. I think that very insightful points and very important points that you have raised. But let me start from your conclusion. The perception or the fear of China exploitation. Usually, you realize that these fear of exploitation doesn't seem to come from the government. It seems to come from independent researchers or foreign partners. So in this case, in the case of Panama, are we seeing that the government is trying to balance between the gap that exists, with regards to law enforcement and security of the country amidst the fears, or the government outrightly dismisses all these fears of exploitation and just, pursuing its agenda in this regard? So that would be the first question for you.
I think that's a fascinating question because it also shows how complex the relationship between the government, the Panamanian government, and China is, and how complex also the relationship between our own governments and the population, the general population is. First of all, we have to analyze that question from a policy perspective. Right now, Panama is about 100 days into a new government. This new government is more oriented towards the challenge of immigration. As you all may know, if you ever hear from Panama, you'll think about the Panama Canal, but you also think about a transit route. So right now, Panama is being used as a transit route of migrants towards the U.S. Of these migrants, about 5 to 10% that are currently in transit through Panama are of Chinese origin. So, policy-wise, both the U.S. and Panama want to preserve the deportation strategy that they have jointly undertaken. The U.S. is currently funding deportation flights from Panama to Colombia, just to give you an example. But in the case of China, they will say we have 5% of the migrants are in transit and are detained in Panama, are from China, so we need to have deportation mechanisms.
I can't say on TikTok.
But this needs to be balanced with another important thing, that Panama has the largest diaspora of Chinese Panamanians in Central America. So we have around 300,000 Panamanians that are of Chinese descent. That wouldn't seem significant to most of you because for most of you, you have inhabitants in your own home countries of millions and millions of persons. In Panama, we are just 5 million persons. Basically, these are the people that can decide an election. 300,000, if they are organized and they vote in bloc, they can decide a general election. What is the position of the diaspora? That's another complex question because the diaspora comes from the south of China. The diaspora, in its majority, migrated to Panama in the midst of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. The majority of diaspora had relationships for about 50 to 70 years with the Republic of China, with Taiwan, not with the PRC. So they tend to be very, very, very concerned about the increase of influence by the PRC in Panama. Although they have also reached a modus vivendi in the sense that they are not going to claim outright that they despise any type of influence by the CCP or by the PRC, they do tend to be very cautious whenever they engage with the PRC. And that leads to another important thing. We have significant presence of Chinese gangs in Panama. Again, this was the only good source that I found about this, and I report this to the China Index in 2023, was the article written by Lilan in Diálogo Américas, because the presence of Chinese gang has never been comprehensively studied. Do you want to know how bad our security establishment is that we were eavesdropping on calls made by members of the gangs, but we didn't have any personnel who could understand Mandarin. So basically, we were just recording and we were depending directly on any type of intel provided by the US. Also, when you analyze the crime rates, it appears that whenever a Chinese gang that is operating in Panama conducts some type of crime, it only takes effect within the Chinese diaspora in Panama. So there is some type of neglect by the Panamanian authorities, and there is some type of operative fear by the diaspora. I don't know if I was sufficiently clear, but this is a topic that has not been studied at all. Because if you take that in conjunction with the presence of United Front groups, you could make interesting comparisons between criminal activity and also political activity and intimidation. That's an entire different universe. But I will stop there.
Sounds good. Thank you again, Alonso, for those insightful comments. So, if anyone within in the panel, in the audience, wants to ask a question, please feel free to use your raise hand button. I have two questions. I'll put these two questions to you, Alonso, and then whilst you do that, I would be monitoring those who raise their hands and then pose the questions to you. Audience can also pose their questions in the chat, and I'll do well to read them to Alonso for his response and feedback. So Alonso, going back to the security and law enforcement, has there been studies on whether or not China's role in these two areas that you studied or that you looked at, has it improved the law enforcement situation in those areas? And also juxtaposing that with the gangs, the Chinese gangs, right? Is that worsening the case or helping the case? And are these surveillance systems also used in monitoring these Chinese gangs? And then the second question, it's about the geopolitics of all of this. You talked about Panama's strategic and dominant relations with the United States and with China's global security initiative, which all of these fall apart. We know that Panama is not an isolated case. It's part of a whole global security initiative that China is undertaking. How is this affecting relations with the U.S. and other allies?
I will jump into the second question, and then I'll ask you to repeat the first one, because the second one is, I think, is the most significant one, mainly because we're in a very complex neighborhood. Historically, Central America has been pejoratively referred to as the U.S. backyard. And Latin America as a whole also has been referred by some sectors as the U.S. backyard. So what we have seen in the last couple of months, no, sorry, not months, in the last couple of years, by China has been a diplomatic offensive in order to further isolate Taipei from multilateral bodies and also diplomatically. In this regard, it is fascinating whenever we take into account what happened pretty recently in Parlacen, in the Central American Parliament. Just a few months ago, I wrote an op-ed for a Nicaraguan newspaper called La Prensa, basically asking civil society in Central America to oppose Russia's bid to become an observer state in Parlacen, in the Central American Parliament. Russia was successful in its bid. Although we kind of reacted late, we were able to at least make them have to fight more for the votes. Instead of gaining 76 votes, they had 65, which meant that in practice they were 2 votes up from the minimum they needed in order to become an observer state. That's being positive. We were partly successful in raising awareness. And why I'm saying that, and why I'm mentioning Russia, because Russia followed the same disinformation and expansion campaign undertaken by China in order to expel Taiwan from Parlacen and to take its seat as an observer state. So in the grand scheme of things in Central America, China is basically increasing its influence, not only at the bilateral level, but also at the multilateral level. The next stop, and this is why Parlacen is so significant, remains the Central American integration system. Why they want to go in there. And that's why I started my presentation with this. They want to go in there because there's a framework treaty on democratic security that basically that will effectively actually prohibit any type of overseas base as the ones they currently have in Argentina or Cuba. In Argentina, they have this space observation base, and in Cuba, they have this cybersecurity base. Any of those type of undertakings in Central America is strictly prohibited by this democratic security treaty framework. And this could be easily changed if China becomes an observer state of the SICA. Why? Because an observer state of the SICA wouldn't be seen as something that is threatening the treaty. And also having relationships with all the states that are party to the SICA would also mean that they wouldn't find any type of opposition within. And why was the Parlacen scheme so important? Because Parlacen has its main seat in Guatemala, the sole remaining ally of Taiwan in Central America. Yes, there's Belize. But if we go back to the SICA operates under the consensus rule. Currently, Guatemala and Belize are opposing China to join the SICA and the expulsion of Taiwan. But if they lose Guatemala, if Guatemala switches recognition, then it will only be Belize. And as part of diplomatic, let's call it diplomatic practice, when consensus is broken by only one state, that state has to accommodate the best interests of all the other interested states and remove its opposition. So basically, you need two. In theory, you have a veto, but in practice, you have a joint veto. Let's call it like that. So that's why I say it's so complex, the relationship security-wise, and it's even more complex when you take into consideration the type of gifts that all of the Central American countries receive from the PRC at the moment they establish diplomatic ties with Beijing. If you look at El Salvador, they receive a library. If you look at Costa Rica, they receive a stadium, and the list goes on and on and on. The only country that apparently didn't receive anything significant was Panama. The most significant thing that they received, according to the public records, was maybe a study undertaking to build a train from one border to another, from Colombia to Costa Rica. But you will also find the Colón C2 Security Center. But after more research, you will actually find that there were a substantial amount of funds received by Panamanian authorities in the concept of non-reimbursable economic assistance. Everybody is saying in the media, opinion makers, people that oppose more comprehensive relationships with the PRC as me, that they had received $142 million in bribes in order to establish diplomatic ties. So whenever you conduct in-depth research, as I have done, you will learn that that money was not actually a bribe, was non-reimbursable economic cooperation that is not subject of any type of oversight under a weak rule of law system that allows China basically not only to lobby, but also to exert some type of control and influence over Panamanian authorities. So that's kind of a copycat that you will find. I'm positive about it in most Central American countries, and also you will find that in different African countries. I don't think I wouldn't be surprised if I will find the same model, because whenever you undertake any serious research on, for example, corrosive capital, I recently finished one for another NGO, US-based NGO. You have many projects that are affected by Chinese corrosive capital that in the end up causing great damage to the rule of law and to democracy. And at the end, that ends up affecting, again, security. And of course, if you promote corruption and you have zero law enforcement, it ends up also affecting democratic governance. But that was the first question. No, the second question. The first one I wanted to hear it again, because I was so excited by the second question that I couldn't hear that. I forgot about the first one.
Actually, your conclusion is a good segue into the first question. The first question is the surveillance, the model, and the two things to talk about, the surveillance that China has set up in these two cities that you referenced. How has that aided, if it has, law enforcement in those cities? And also, what are the issues around privacy and also abuse of power, like you sort of alluded to? How does that look like? Has it helped with regards to law enforcement and general security of Panama, or specifically those two cities, or has it worsened the situation with issues such as privacy and intrusion?
Yeah, it's hard to tell, but if we will draw any type of parallelism to any other type of cooperation relationship that Panama has, for example, with the United States, you will tend to think that it's close to zero. And why I'm saying that? In order, for example, to have effective law enforcement cooperation, the U.S. has to invest significant amount of money, number one, but also of human capital in order to obtain concrete and effective results. For example, you have to undertake training of attorneys, of prosecutors. You need to undertake training on civil society, on security operators, on security specialists, and this takes significant time. The model of cooperation is comprehensive. You need training, you need to have sustainability, you need to have concrete objectives and a defined strategy. That's the case with U.S. cooperation. The case with win-win, and I'm quoting, Chinese cooperation is that you basically receive anything you want no strings attached, and with no results. It is not results oriented. We just give you this entire center, which is a multi-million-dollar investment, and we won't teach you how to use it. We don't know how that fits into your overall security strategy for that city. We don't care if it's going to affect civil rights or civil liberties. And we actually do care that you don't know anything substantial on how these systems operate, because we are gathering data. We are gathering intelligence. We are getting information out of that. You are not getting anything of that. Because with all these biometric identification softwares and all of that, what we are getting is access to your castle. What I try to say to most of you whenever I talk about the Colón 2 project is that Panama gave China the keys of the castle. That's a term we use here in Panama, las llaves del castillo, in the sense that we gave it all. We gave them full access to our security operations center in the most dangerous city of the country. And this is the same city where China has control over the main port that provides logistic supports to the Panama Canal, where it has control over another island where they are building another port, where they used to have control over an energy plant, and where they want to basically establish its main power grab strategy. Basically, this is the place where they want to conduct most of their operations. And this is not at all being studied in my home country. Like, even when I was conducting the research that I mentioned to you guys on the China Index, I said, like, hey, this is an interesting question they're posing to me. They're saying if the Chinese have undertaken any type of police operation in Panama, and you would think that the clear answer is no. If you access open access sources, the answer will be a clear no. There is no reports in newspapers, there's no report in TV shows that there were Chinese police forces undertaking police or security or law enforcement operations in Panama. Nonetheless, if you use Twitter or X, as it is now called, you will find several videos in which Chinese officials, Chinese police officials, are conducting security operations in Colón again. So it is, although we don't have significant data to support my theory, I will say, of course, it has something to do. Because this 2-minute video posted by the Chinese embassy saying that a commissioner from the police of X city came to Panama in order to conduct security operations against the Chinese Panamanians, owners of stores that were being robbed by members of a Chinese gang in Panama. If it doesn't have something to do with Colón 2, which has cameras and it has video vigilance and all of this around the city, I don't know what it has to do with anything. Basically, there is a clear link between one and another. But the main challenge we face here is the absence of any data. Our data, we don't have our data. We don't have comprehensive studies on, again, the only piece of information, I think it's Lena's paper, I think he shared the paper with you guys there. The only comprehensive information on the presence of Chinese triads or Chinese gangs in Panama is information provided by Leland. The only information we have, for example, on Colón 2 or where the information goes, we have close to zero information. The only thing is a report that I wrote for Expediente Abierto a couple of years ago, 2023, sorry. And that's it. We have incredible access to data, which again leaves us in a very vulnerable strategic position.
Thank you so much, Alonso, again for giving us that background and for all of that. It's really grateful for your insights. Glad to have Mr. Paul Nantulya with us. Paul, as I introduced earlier, is a research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Paul has written on China's policing on the continent, and his paper talked about some of the issues that you have raised. And once Paul is here, I'll let Paul sort of give us a background as to his insights on China's presence in our security and law enforcement sector on the continent. Paul, over to you. And thanks. It's good to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arhin. Is my sound coming out clear? Okay, perfect. I hope my connection holds. I've been having connection problems here. Well, first of all, thank you. And thank you to Alonso as well. Very insightful comments. As you were speaking, I was trying to think of possible situations on the African continent where that kind of issue has emerged. But let me just start by giving background. All the security dimensions of Chinese engagements in Africa were initially not pronounced. The relationship that developed between China and its African partners in the context of FOCAC initially developed as commercial and trade-oriented relations. Before the establishment of the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, in 2000, China did have quite a respectable economic footprint. There were all kinds of projects that Chinese entities were involved with on the continent. The Tazara project, the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, which was China's biggest and most ambitious and most expensive foreign aid project at the time. There were many others, right? So the involvement of Chinese state-owned firms in mega infrastructure projects on the continent is not something new. It did not start with the Belt and Road. It has been there. It just became more focused, it became more centralized, and it became more expansive under the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. But even then, the first 6 years of FOCAC was still very, very focused on commerce, on trade, on expanding trade between China and various African countries, and establishing new markets. This was the era of the going out strategy of Jiang Zemin, where state-owned enterprises, China has millions of these state-owned enterprises, huge conglomerates, to go out and capture markets, especially in emerging economies. So Africa became important in that context. At the 2012 FOCAC is when security issues became very pronounced, and so that was a major shift within the FOCAC structure. So it evolved from diplomacy to commerce and trade, and then it began to take on security aspects, such that by the 2015 FOCAC, law enforcement, military cooperation became a standard feature of FOCAC. As we speak today in 2024, China trains more African security sector professionals than any other industrialized country. You're talking of at least 2,000 military officers a year in various Chinese military academies, and between 2008 and 2021, over 2,000 African police and law enforcement personnel from different parts of the public security systems in African countries had trained in Chinese police academies. China has a whole system of police and law enforcement academies, the Public Security University, the People's Armed Police College, and there's so many, to such an extent that specific police training institutions in the People's Republic of China have developed niche relationships with certain countries. So, for instance, Shandong Police College has a very, very close relationship with the South African police, which has been training the Metropolitan Police, the Johannesburg Police Department, and so on. Shandong Police Department also has a relationship with the African Union, right, on counterterrorism issues, and so on. So, police and law enforcement has developed, and we saw at the recently concluded FOCAC summit that took place in September, and I was in Beijing during those events. One of the first post-FOCAC items on the agenda, which took place in Beijing, was a meeting between the Ministry of Public Security and the East African Police Coordination structure. This is a forum that brings East African countries together, East African police chiefs, the police coordination cell, right? So that meeting took place. Another meeting took place again in Beijing a few days after the FOCAC summit that brought defense chiefs from over 40 African countries and military chiefs. And that meeting was held at the People's Liberation Army's National Defense University, and that meeting focused on professional military education. So security has become a critical feature in the relationship. There are four main drivers of why Chinese police entities, law enforcement entities are engaged in the African continent in increasing with increasing frequency. The first is the sheer size of the Chinese economic footprint on the African continent. There are about 10,000 Chinese firms. The vast majority of them are state-owned enterprises that are operating in different African countries. Right, 10,000. That's a fairly large number. When you look at the portfolio of these state-owned enterprises, in construction alone, the research is telling us that 1 out of every 5 mega infrastructure projects on the continent is built by a Chinese state-owned enterprise or a coalition or a conglomerate of Chinese state-owned enterprises in the infrastructure sector. In the port sector alone, over 40 ports on the African continent, from the east coast to the west coast, to the north of Africa, have either been constructed by Chinese state-owned firms or have been partially or fully financed by Chinese policy banks and entail a level of management. Sometimes it's shared management, sometimes it's management between Chinese state-owned enterprises and African state-owned enterprises. It's a whole mix. But the number currently stands at 40. So these are big investments. And we have seen, anytime you do a Google search of an attack on a Chinese oil workers, attacks on Chinese state-owned enterprises, this has become a common feature of the Chinese story on the African continent. Attacks, hijackings, kidnappings. So we have seen that the Ministry of Public Security and other public security entities in the People's Republic of China have signed a number of agreements with their African counterparts. Wide-ranging agreements, from extradition to training to the deployment of Chinese public security entities in different African countries to deal with different situations. We've seen that in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've seen that in Nigeria. We've seen it in Angola. We've seen it in Mozambique. There was a very interesting case at the beginning of last year when Chinese police commandos deployed into Uganda and conducted an operation jointly with Ugandan Special Forces to surveil, interdict, and arrest wanted Chinese who were said to be criminals, members of a Chinese gang that was operating in mainland China. And there's no media mention in terms of what might have happened, or whether Ugandan and Chinese forces found a way to apprehend them. But nevertheless, there were a number of Chinese criminals, as they were described, who were apprehended in different parts of Uganda through this joint operation. And it was, you can imagine. I mean, this was it was the media story of the day. But nevertheless, those kind of operations have been conducted, right? We've seen those sorts of operations being conducted between the Chinese and Angolan special forces. We have also seen the deployment of the Chinese elements way before the Belt and Road started in the Nuba Mountains in southern Kordofan to rescue Chinese oil workers. So this has it's increasingly becoming a feature of Chinese engagement. The issue of extradition is an interesting one. It's a very interesting one that I write about in a study on Chinese law enforcement in Africa that was published a few years ago. In 2000, China did not have a single extradition treaty with any African country. But right now, an increasing number of African countries have concluded different types of extradition agreements with the People's Republic of China. One example of this was right here in Kenya. Some years ago, there was a high-profile case of a large number of Taiwanese and mainland Chinese that were accused of allegedly operating an illegal telecommunications infrastructure in Kenya. Now, that interdiction and subsequent extradition to mainland China was conducted through a joint operation of Chinese and Kenyan law enforcement. And this was covered extensively in the Kenyan media, right down to the specific details of how that operation was carried out. And part of the reason, again, which I'll speak about much later, is when you have an environment where you have a relatively free and open media, some of these issues come to light and they can be discussed by observers and generally by the population at large. And so it was a fairly controversial issue, because as this operation was being conducted, an urgent interdict was presented before one of the high courts in Nairobi, and a high court judge actually stayed the extradition of those persons, of the Chinese and Taiwanese persons. But nevertheless, the extradition continued. So it was very, very controversial. And when they arrived back on Chinese territory, they all received very long sentences, right? So again, that is another example that shows just how far Chinese law enforcement engagement with African countries has come. Training, as I mentioned earlier, has become a key feature. Again, back here in Kenya, Chinese security firms worked with the Kenyan police, according to media reports, to train a special unit of constables, which was tasked with protecting and securing the standard gauge railway that was built by China Roads and Bridges Corporation in collaboration with the Kenyan government, right? In addition to that, China put an offer on the table to train Kenyan police, to take Kenyan police to China for extended training of different kinds. It's unclear whether that relationship continues under the Ruto administration, but certainly under the Kenyatta administration, there was a close relationship that had developed between Kenyan and Chinese law enforcement. But Kenya is not a unique case. We have seen this type of coordination and collaboration, for instance, between South Africa and China. I mean, law enforcement is a big part of that. Is a big part of that engagement of South Africa-China engagement. As I mentioned earlier, there are quite a number of safe cities projects run by Huawei, which have set up, for instance, command centers. Not to use Kenya as an example, but there are many others, right? To basically integrate all these different police units under one umbrella. In terms of surveillance, in terms of protection, in terms of operations, and that sort of thing. Even countries like Lesotho, right? So countries like Lesotho, there is a committee, a national security and national public security committee that brings members of the Lesotho security services together with Chinese, including Chinese investors, as well as the Chinese embassy, to basically establish some sort of coordination in terms of protecting Chinese investments in that country. So there are quite a number of drivers. The increasing economic footprint that I discussed earlier. Some of it is an outcome of larger security engagement, military to military engagement. But then there's also a dimension, and I think I'll stop here. There's a dimension that is not often discussed in the types of forum, in the kind of forum that we're having right now, which is that there are institutional, structural, and behavioral similarities between the Chinese police and Chinese police entities and the Chinese public policing function and African policing systems. So on the African continent, policing is an executive function. You have a minister of police who is in the executive part of government, right?
Can you name a black artist who has a song that you can use for TBR? Rack City, bitch. Who is the that you
I think we're losing.
You have the police units like the CID.
Paul, you can go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, it's good. It's back. You can go ahead.
Yeah. So policing as an executive function, as a function of the office of the president, as a function of the executive branch of government, right? So you have a national police. It's actually a national police force. So the police is a national force. This is very different from the United States or from the continental policing models, right? Where policing functions are completely decentralized and are not part of the executive branch of government, right? So the African policing systems are very different in that sense. Even the ranking system in a typical African police force, you have commanders, you have lieutenants, you even have generals, you have police generals, right? And interestingly, you also have a dynamic that you see here, especially in East Africa, where you have military officers that are deployed as part of the police leadership, right? You'd never have this in a decentralized policing system, right? Now, all the things that I've just described, and there are many others, but I'll just focus on these, things like crime intelligence and all that. If you look at how the Chinese People's Armed Police is structured, it's very similar, right? It's under the Ministry of Public Security. That's the executive level of government, right? Very close relationship with the higher echelons, right, of the president's executive office, right? So policing is an executive function. The ranks of the People's Armed Police, again, what I've just described with the African continent, this is also what you find within the Chinese policing systems. So because you have those similarities in behavior, attitude, you have those similarities in structure and function, the Chinese police and African police forces basically speak a common language and are able to plug into one another's systems, right? So that affords the Chinese police entities an avenue, right, to establish the kind of partnerships they believe they need to establish to be able to look after Chinese public security interest. And what are China's public security interests in Africa? The high numbers of the state-owned enterprises which have got security budgets and security issues, right? Secondly, issues of extradition. We've seen extraditions, as I described earlier, taking place in a number of African countries. Actually, North Africa is very interesting because we've actually seen extradition even of Uyghur students from countries like Egypt, right, in operations, and even the questioning of some of these students, right, on the ground in Africa. So it's a large piece of what Chinese public security institutions are doing on the African continent. And the third one is it's part of what I would call a blended security approach. The Chinese government is trying to look for the most optimum security mix that it feels it needs to be able to provide a security blanket for its security interests in various parts of Africa and other parts of the global south. Policing, law enforcement, extradition, and the use of security firms is part of that larger architecture that the Chinese government has been experimenting. I've said enough, and I would be very happy to take questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul, for those insights. We're grateful that you shared these with us. I would ask any members of the audience to use their raise hand button or share their questions in the chat, and I'll read them to our panelists for their thoughts on them. Paul, just as some African leaders continue to applaud China or even call for more training of security personnel, we have independent researchers, we have people who are looking at all of these from outside and who are calling or who are afraid, calling for caution in all of these things. And you raise some of these points that we should be cautious about in your paper and in some of your presentations. Just opposing the two, what is the way forward? How are African governments thinking about these security cooperations? And how is the rest of Africa in terms of independent researchers and the general population? What is the sense out there? And where do you see this going?
Right. Look, I think when it comes to independent networks of China-Africa studies, the universities, the think tanks, academics, this sector has been growing encouragingly. It has been growing. And what it means is that the story of China-Africa relations is not just limited to official engagements between the Chinese government and African governments. There's more voices and there's more analysis in the room, which I think is a good thing. The focus on Chinese security issues within these independent networks of Africa-China relations is still not, there's no critical mass. It hasn't been brought to scale, right? So there are really a handful of African institutions and African China-Africa specialists that really focus on the security aspects of China-Africa relations. And I think that needs to change. Because regardless of whether it is China or United States or United Kingdom, whether it's France, whenever there is a security element involved in a relationship, you're always going to have, because you see, policing, those sorts of operations bring with citizens. So then human rights issues of accountability then become very important, right? And when investments have got that security underpinning, then it means that the likelihood of having situations like that is increased. So I think there's a need to kind of build more capacity within African think tanks and African academic institutions to build that capacity to begin to focus on security issues over and above the economic relationships or the trade-related relationships between China and its African partners. I think that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing is, when you talk about security issues involving China and Africa, it does raise alarm bells in a number of areas. And part of the reason why it raises alarm bells is African societies have had very negative experiences with foreign military and security intervention from the 90s. That's number one. Number two, Africans have had a very negative experience with military government. So when you look at the Afrobarometer reports and read them very carefully, you find that the demand for democracy remains solid. Over 60% remains solid. The demand for democratic government. Over 75%, I believe the figure is 75%, reject military government. An even higher percentage reject one-party rule. What that tells us is that the demand for democratic systems where you have apolitical military forces and police forces, which conduct themselves in accordance with constitutional provisions, there's a very strong demand for that, right? And so that, in and of itself, is important, right? Because it means that the likelihood of African audiences embracing police systems that are unaccountable, police systems that thrive on impunity, there's major pushback against that. So while we can talk about all the training that is being done, it's also important to look at for whom is that training supposedly being done. That training is supposed to be done to protect citizens. So if citizens are demanding greater standards of democracy and accountability in terms of how their security forces are managed, then that is a good thing. It's a good thing. And I think it needs to be supported, it needs to be engaged, it needs to be encouraged, and I think there needs to be better awareness. So I think that would be my answer to the different sets of questions that you've asked, that there is a big and sustained and robust demand on the African continent for security forces that respect and adhere to democratic standards. African citizens are not going to expect no less.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that. I think Dr. Pakwesi Heto has his hand up. Doc, please, you have the stage.
Oh, thank you, Paul. As always, this is brilliant analysis. I just wanted to just push back a little bit to see if maybe you could reflect on some of the similarities you were drawing between the Chinese system and the African system and then the US system. I agree that in some ways there is a difference there, but I see the difference not in terms of whether it is part of the executive branch or whether it is part of the, a different unit. Because if you look at the US closely, you realize that the Interior Department, which oversees a lot of the federal police force, is also very much integrated into our executive branch. But policing is more decentralized. I think this is where you were going with that comment. Where you have policing at the state level and all of that. But in the case of Kenya, in the case of Ghana, and all of those places, policing is centralized. So maybe what might be the similar between the Chinese system and our system is the level of centralization. But does that also mean that if we in the US wants to develop partnership with the African side in terms of improving policing, because we've done a lot of work on the military side, does our level of decentralization prohibit that kind of partnership? That would be number 1 point. Number 2 point would be, to what extent are we supposed to be concerned with the level of surveillance equipment that is being exchanged between the African side and the Chinese side? Right? Because more of the things that African governments are interested in is maybe getting access to Chinese surveillance technology. And that serves 2 different security reasons, right? It gives authoritarian regimes on the continent more power to make citizens more legible to them. But at the same time, what happens to the data that China is able to collect on African citizens? So I'm going to probably just end those 2 by questions.
Thank you, Papasi. Paul, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Yes, what I was referring to was the level of centralization. That's what I was talking about. Yes, it's the Department of Interior with federal, not state or local police. It's federal, which I think is an important difference. But yes, this is what I was referring to when I was talking about the centralized systems, right? Which is similar. So it means that police forces from Africa and the People's Armed Police are they come from a common language, a common experience. I think maybe what I should have added is when you have executive level highly centralized policing systems like that, police forces become very susceptible to politicization and political control. And we've seen that this is a major problem on the African continent. You read any Afrobarometer report, police forces happen to be the most highly feared, right, and also the most highly corrupt in across the African continent. So it's definitely a concern because if they're going to an external partner, and that external partner has a similar structure, and we all know that the Chinese police is controlled by the Communist Party of China. It's controlled by the ruling party. The ruling party controls the national security and the national security architecture in China is controlled by the party, right? So there's a risk that those types of the methodology of policing, the models, as well as political control, it could be perhaps not across the board, but certain African countries that come from a similar predisposition, it might plug into pre-existing unaccountable security systems on the African continent. That's where the strategic risk is. So that's what I would say with regard to that. With regard to whether the U.S. can do police work in Africa, but I mean the U.S. law enforcement collaborates with Africa, provides training. I mean, there's a major law enforcement program that runs out of Botswana for African law enforcement personnel that's funded by the United States, and United States law enforcement personnel are then able to go and develop the sorts of relationships that they need to develop in different African countries. So the United States does do a lot of work, and it's not just the U.S. There are many others. Because there's certain common themes and common perspectives that the 2 sides have been able to develop. So I just need to say that there's a lot of police engagement, right, that takes place between different U.S. police systems, because it's not one, there's several. It's highly decentralized, and different African policing systems. So it's not new and it's not unusual.
All right, so before we wrap up, I do not see any questions here, but my last set of questions to both of you. So I'll start with Alonso, and then Paul can close us with that. Alonso, if you look at, we're going back to when we started this whole thing on trans-regionalism. Do you think, and what is your take on whether or not Africa and the Americas have had an opportunity to study or to learn from each other with regards to policing and policing, law enforcement and security, and what are the opportunities for Africa and the Americas? Do you think, and for me, quite clear, there are quite striking similarities with, the situation in Panama and what Paul has described to us. So what for you would be the way forward in terms of learning and in terms of partnerships. Because one of the things I see from the conversation is also the idea of a void or of a gap that has been created, which China is seeking to fill. And so how can Africa and America, the Americas, take advantage of this void and collaboratively work towards that? And again, final one, with regards to studying, the peace, security, and police in Africa and the Americas, what should academics in Africa and in the Americas be looking at? And should we be looking at more cooperation and collaboration between scholars in these areas?
Certainly, the parallelisms between Paul's presentation and mine are striking in the sense that joint police operations, although not widely covered in an unmilitarized country as Panama is, with a very weak police that historically has depended on the U.S. for law enforcement purposes, it's amazing when you compare it to all the examples that Paul provided in his presentation, all the type of joint operations that have taken place. So yes, there's many similarities, and I believe that one of the keys to make some improvements in these areas of transregional cooperation is defining the common ground we share. Yes, we do share the fact that there is strategic interest, for example, from the U.S. and from China on both of our regions. But apart from that, and going out of that false binary, that in the sense that either you are with the U.S. or you're with China, we have to go further, and we have to find this intersection between the common shared values we have. We have a strong interest in strengthening our democratic systems or our anti-corruption and transparency systems, and also on promoting a significant respect for human rights. And in all of those regards, cooperation on security and law enforcement with China tends to affect and erode democratic governments, tends to ease up corruption or instrumentalize anti-corruption campaigns for political purposes, and also ends up on grave violation of human rights. When I was hearing Paul, I was thinking, all of those persons that have been extradited to China, he mentioned Uyghurs. He mentions the case of Egyptians, for example. A lot of those persons certainly were subject of torture or cruel and unhuman treatment. And in that regard, we should draw the same parallelisms and remain focused on what unites us. And what unites us is not our allegiance to the U.S. or allegiance to the destructive power of China. No, what unites us is precisely the values, the hardcore values, which may sound like empty words, but are actually more significant than that may seem. I'll just stop there.
Yes. Thank you so much, Alonso. Paul, I can give you 1 minute.
Do you want me to say something?
It's on cooperation between Africa and the Americas on security, policing, and
Yes, I would say 4 areas. One, training. I think foundations, donor partners of supporting research, supporting the development of research on both sides, on the African continent and Latin America and the Caribbean. I think more training on media coverage, how giving media personnel the skills and the techniques they need to report on security issues. I think that is absolutely key. Secondly, on both sides, more grant making to get as many scholars as possible into this public security space, because there's very little reporting on it. And there are certain techniques that one uses to be able to get some insight, for instance, into policing. And in Chinese policing in particular is something that it's not an easy field, but there are ways around those difficulties which require a level of training. So I think on both ends that would be required. And then the third end is understanding the training itself. What happens in Chinese police academies with these African and Latin American forces? What does the training actually look like, so that we speak with authority and with empirical evidence? And then fourthly, understanding the uptake of this training. When these police officers go back to Colombia, to Nicaragua, to Mexico, to Nairobi, to Johannesburg, to what extent do they use that training? What do they use that training for, and stuff like that? So I think these for me would be the four things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alonso, and thank you so much, Paul, for making this worthwhile. Thank you to all the audience, all the wonderful people who joined us and staying with us. We are most grateful and hope to catch you in the next session. Thank you and have a good one.